Welcome to a bonus episode of the Deep and Durable Learning Podcast. I think you'll be intrigued by these bonus episodes, which center on the Summer Institute in Teaching Science, also known as SITS, which I founded back in 2003 and which I continue to direct to the present. SITS is devoted to faculty and curriculum development. Nearly all the faculty of the Division of Natural Science at Bob Jones University have been through this intensive, one-of-a-kind program, which requires 4 10-week summers to complete. In these bonus episodes, we'll take a look at what has made SITS so transformational, both for our faculty and our curriculum. Talking today with Dr. Brian Vogt, who's the chair of the chemistry department at Bob Jones University, longtime colleague and one of my fellow SITS faculty who was in on the ground floor when the Summer Institute in Teaching Science was first formulated as an idea back in 2003. So we go way back. Welcome to the program, Brian.
Thanks, Mike.
We're going to be talking today about one course for simplicity's sake, but it's a 2-semester course, and that's general chemistry. And Brian's taught general chemistry for many decades now, but he hasn't always been pleased with the result in the classroom. And this kind of takes us back to the days before SITS existed, when both of us became uneasy with the quality of our teaching, not for lack of motivation, but for lack of results with our students. So maybe you want to take us back there, Brian, because I think the seeds of what is true now of your chemistry course were sown back then, and they're bearing fruit now.
Well, as I started off my teaching career after finishing my PhD work, I dove in with great zeal and love for my subject and love for my students. And I taught with intensity, which all of my students will tell you is my nature.
I'll second that.
And I found that things were going fine. At least I thought they were. And as I would interact with my students following my class, and in fact I could say this about both semesters of general chemistry, I was not pleased with the level of retention. I would talk to them about things, and I would see that things are not sticking as well as they should have stuck. This, in fact, was not unique to general chemistry. I was, for some years, taught organic chemistry lab. And when I first took the courses, I did a major revision on everything that we did. And after teaching that for a few years and interacting with students, I found that some of what I was doing in that lab class also hadn't stuck so well. Now, these are red flags, because our goal is not to stuff information into a mind for tests and then have it disappear after the semester. Our goal is to train the students how to think. So I became very concerned about these things because I viewed them as indicators of shortcomings in my teaching. So it was at that point in time that I started engaging other faculty members in discussion. And Mike and I have been friends for many years, and he was one of the ones that I engaged in discussion about this. So when I realized that I was dissatisfied with some things, I realized I was going to have to change some stuff too.
So how did you get some direction about what to change. I mean, on some level, professional educators spend their lives trying things out that are the latest hot tip or trick, and they never seem to land on anything, even from a pragmatic standpoint, that becomes an enduring strategy. So I know you well enough that you didn't take the hot tips and tricks path at all, but how did you zero in on what the root problem must be?
Well, that's a good question. And the reality is, I have to reflect on how I think as a model of how I want my students to think.
And when we say that, you mean you're thinking like a chemist. You're in a chemistry course, you're trying to get your students to think like a chemist, not uniquely Brian Vogt as a chemist, but in the broader sense of the discipline, the attributes that make somebody successful in thinking as a chemist.
Yes, and let me just for a moment broaden the conversation a little bit more. The way God wired me, I'm an interdisciplinary kind of thinker. As an undergraduate here at Bob Jones, I was a biology major with a chemistry minor, although I took enough chemistry to actually have the credit equivalent of a second major in chemistry. And I love biology, I love chemistry, and I did my graduate work in pharmaceutical sciences. And all of this stuff connects together numerous disciplines. So I like to connect together chemistry with biology. And that's easy to do in pharmaceutical sciences, where you're connecting things like microbiology and cell biology and molecular biology with general chemistry and organic chemistry and biochemistry. There are places when physics comes into the picture. And so I like to draw connections, and those connections are not simply informational connections, they're logical connections as well. And I would say that pharmaceutical sciences and related topics, subjects, are very highly interdisciplinary in nature. And if you delight in that kind of thing, it's really easy to make connections. So having said that, what we're really talking about is the logic of the connections between areas in my mind, but also the logic of the connections in a given subject. So when I teach general chemistry, I am talking about the logic of chemistry. How does a chemist think about this? And I'm seeking to develop the ability of a student to think as a chemist. But I'm sometimes connecting those things to other areas. For example, when we talk about chemical kinetics in the second semester of my general chemistry sequence, I often will bring in the concept of pharmacokinetics, which deals with how drugs are distributed throughout the body, how the body metabolizes them, how the body gets rid of them. And it turns out the principles of pharmacokinetics are the same as basic chemical kinetics. And so this kind of thing has broad application, but you have to focus on the logic of how things work. What's the reasoning involved? What are the thinking processes? That's what I mean when I say reflect on my thinking. And I want my students to get there too. My teaching wasn't getting my students there, so I knew I had to make some changes.
Your teaching was not getting your students to think like chemists. You had the expertise in chemistry, but they needed to gain that expertise, and it couldn't be a mental download, as it were. So how do you propose to build the thinking on some basis other than just presentation of information?
Now we're getting to the core of what counts here. And I had a humorous thing yesterday. I had a video conference with a potential transfer student and his parents. And this young man had a very negative experience in general chemistry at another school. And his mother said regarding that teacher, "Now, Dr. So-and-so is a brilliant man." And I know whenever anybody says that, they're usually setting up to say something else. And so it went like, "Dr. So-and-so is a brilliant man, but..." And the "but" part had to do with the quality and caliber of the teaching. I've heard that many times over the years, and I hope nobody ever says that about me. Ryan Vought's a brilliant man, but... And of course, what's happened in that situation is a failure in teaching. Clearly it wasn't compelling. Clearly it wasn't engaging. Clearly it wasn't effective. And absolutely, Mike, you're right. It's not a matter of simply dumping information. The idea here is not to load students up with facts. You can get facts from online or in a book. Students don't need me as a fact delivery person. What they need me for is to engage them in the thinking of the discipline in a logical, compelling manner that builds. So if you're I would characterize effective teaching as teaching that leads to student understanding. Achieving this in science requires what I think is a conscious and constant focus on explaining how the natural world works from the point of view of a chemist, in my case. And I do use facts to illustrate things, but the logic of chemistry unfolds in my class over the course of the semester. I start with basic concepts and basic principles and apply them and assess those with reading quizzes, with homework questions, with tests, with laboratory work that involves students to analyze data. After collecting data, analyze the data, draw conclusions from the data. And so you have to start with the basic fundamental concepts and then build logically on them.
So you're headed for, on these assessments, you're headed for a view of how deep is the understanding based on their ability not just to recall what you said or data that they produced in the laboratory, but much more of a emphasis on understanding that leads to appropriate application to solve problems that are within the domain of a chemist and reachable if somebody in fact understood on the level they were supposed to understand. Is that what I'm hearing?
That's exactly what you're hearing. The student, of course, would like things to be, at least some students would like things to be pretty straightforward. I had a student actually on a student evaluation comment something to the effect of, in class you should just work through the same kind of problems that we have in the tests. Kind of a formulaic approach to doing well in the tests is what that really is pointing to. Well, that's not going to happen in my class. What I'm aiming for is to demonstrate understanding by assessing with application. Now, in chemistry, this involves conceptual logic. It also involves a lot of mathematical logic. In general chemistry, we use a lot of algebra, basic algebra, but lots and lots of it, word problems. It does involve the ability to take information, draw conclusions from it, do things with it, successful calculations in some cases. And I'm not convinced a student understands unless they can do this. It's the application to the solution of problems that convinces me that they really know what they're talking about. And I want them to know what they're talking about.
So in the broader arc of your story, what you didn't do was lower the bar in terms of assessment. Your lack of comfort with their understanding did not lead to, well, let's assess something else other than understanding. You held the line in ways that continued to demand understanding from the student. You've talked a bit about designing your course around a group of core concepts how is the big question, I think, for a lot of people who are listening. So we know that learning wasn't occurring as it should have. We did not change what the expectation was about what learning looked like. So rather than now nobody meets the mark, because nobody's getting there, or virtually nobody, how do we get to the point where the class is structured in such a way that students can successfully get to what admittedly is a higher bar than information recall? How did you take your expertise and use it at the service of student learning?
I think even before I was more clearly focused on the deficiencies in my teaching, my students were still having a moderate amount of success. The issue is I don't think I was getting them as far as I could have taken them. That was certainly not their fault. That was certainly my fault. As I've indicated, I structured my courses so that the concepts and principles build logically. I do think I've had some success in this. I looked at one of my recent student evaluations, and a student commented this. He or she said, "The course follows a distinct path that is easy to follow and builds on itself well." I think that's a pretty good, succinct summary from a student about what the perception in a well-designed course should be.
So you intended for that to be the case, but the fact that a student is calling attention to it means that it's actually working for the learner, and not just a theoretical underpinning of the course.
That's exactly right. And I would like to revisit the idea of what it means to teach a science class effectively. I think it involves a lot of explanation. We're not simply dumping facts, as we've already referred to. We're trying to get students to understand how the world works. And the world is complicated. And scientists are in the business of understanding the world. I mean, we want our students to have the same kind of understanding that we have. Not the same scope, because obviously they haven't had graduate work in chemistry. But the idea of explanation is something that is a very, very big part of what I do. I would say it's a major part of what I do, if not the major part of what I do, is explanation. Of course, I have to provide information that gives context, important examples, but the explanation of how a chemical reaction works, why certain things happen when that reaction takes place, how do we account for what takes place there? What does this mean in real life? Does it apply to real life? And so sometimes I bring simple examples in from real life context, just from everyday life. I'll bring something in that they can relate to, but not simply as an illustration, but as let's discuss this. And let's talk about, from a chemistry standpoint, how does a chemist think about this? And it always involves explanation.
Okay, so you mentioned the word discuss, because when I think about, so my course is designed so that we're emphasizing an explanation for phenomena. That could be that I've constructed this explanation that you're going to now listen to and absorb and internalize. But you mentioned the word "we discuss it," and to me that's a hallmark of a different approach that's not teacher-centered, that actually pulls the listener into a reasoning process. Am I right about that?
You're absolutely right about that. So let me talk a little bit about how I use a textbook.
Okay.
Because I use textbooks a lot. And I would say the choice of a textbook for a college course is not always easy. Next month, I'll be starting my 40th year of teaching at BJU. And in my 39 years so far, I've taught general chemistry every one of those semesters. And I have yet to find a perfect general chemistry text. All of them have shortcomings. Here's a student comment, and this is also recent. He says, "Dr. Vogt is excellent at distilling the core ideas from the jumbled mess that is the textbook and presenting them." Well, now, the text that I use isn't actually a jumbled mess. But I think the student is referring to the fact that there's a lot of complexity in it. And of course, this is a complex subject. I think he's also referring to the fact that it's encyclopedic. My goal in a course is not to, quote, cover everything that's in the book, unquote. My goal is to cover the important stuff. And so, the text that I use in general chemistry, I chose because it's better at explaining things than any other text I have seen, while at the same time being briefer than many. I don't think there's any general chemistry book out there that students will not find frustrating as they learn the subject. So I have to deal with that. So how do I deal with that? Well, I require the students to read relevant sections and take quizzes before most class periods. The questions I ask in those quizzes are generally often things that require thought and understanding, and the purpose is to prepare them mentally for class discussion. So, I do use some of the graphics in the text to illustrate aspects of what we discuss, and I incorporate those into my PowerPoint slides. And while we're talking about PowerPoint, I'd like to just say a few things about
Sure.
PowerPoint. I don't simply read my slides to the students. I realize that in some contexts, teachers do that. But that's not how my class works. I create slides to be used as a platform for discussion, or if you'd like to think of it as a framework for discussion. My classes involve a lot of interaction, and I want my students to focus on understanding what we're doing and participating in the discussion. So I actually make my slides available to the students before class starts, so they don't need to write down what's on the slides. They can simply take notes on the discussion instead. And so as I work through a particular topic with them, I'm frequently asking questions. I had a student who, in fact, said in a recent evaluation, he did an excellent job in asking thought-provoking questions in lecture. So the goal is to probe their thinking, to engage them mentally in the logic of the discipline, the logic of chemistry. How do you think as a chemist? To ask questions that once they're asked, they want to know the answers to. Now, sometimes these questions are general questions that I ask the entire class. Most of my questions are not simply rhetorical. Most of them are real, honest questions that I expect an answer to. But as we do this, I engage in discussion. Sometimes to engage the student in discussion, I'll have them simply discuss things with their neighbor. So I'll explain something and I'll say, okay, here's the question. Discuss that with your neighbor. Be prepared to tell me what you think. Other times, I break my class up into small groups of, say, 3 students, and I'll give them something to work on. So this is active learning. And I'm sure there are many ways you could do active learning. I found that the breaking up students into groups is a very helpful thing because it gives them an opportunity to work their thinking on whatever we've been discussing in class. And I tell them, be prepared to give me your answer and be prepared to explain to the class how you got your answer. And sometimes I'll poll the class for answers and I'll find out, oh, I've got different answers to the same question. That's a golden opportunity for me because that means there were misconceptions going on somewhere. And I can follow up on those misconceptions. So I do a lot of interaction with my students during class, and the whole purpose is to explore the thinking.
Do they feel threatened by this interaction, or have you found ways to normalize this and make it not predictable in the absolute sense, but there's a rhythm to the class that means if you're well prepared for class through serious engagement with your assignments outside of class, that there should be nothing onerous about being called on in class. How do you handle that?
Boy, that's an important area you've just identified, Mike. I think we teachers have to be very careful that we provide a safe environment for our students when it comes to questions. And I have to confess that there have been times in my teaching over the years where I haven't handled this properly, or I haven't handled something else properly. But as I've become more proficient in teaching, I have worked hard at being careful to make the questioning environment a safe environment. Now, how does one do that? How do you make a questioning environment safe for students? Well, I think the first thing, and I think this is foundational to any kind of teaching, is that you have to care for the student and you have to respect the student. If you really love them, and I do, if you really love the student, you care for them, not just about their academics, but you care for them as a person as a whole. You care for them as a brother or sister in Christ if they know the Lord. You'll approach them with care. I have to be gentle in my questioning approach. And right at the beginning of the semester, the first time they know you, you set the pace. And when you ask a question and the student's answer is wrong, the first time that happens, what you say and what you do is the most important thing in the semester, because it's going to set the tone. If you deliberately or inadvertently hammer the student, you've just shut down the entire class, and you're not going to have an opportunity. So this business of it is the questioning threatening or safe is critical. And so there's more than one way you deal with this. Sometimes a person appears to be willing to engage in discussion, and you can explore that. I had a situation where I had a student who I asked a question, and he clearly was in fear of what I was asking him. And I don't want my students in fear when I'm engaging in questioning with them. So what I did with him was I simply proceeded to ask him a series of questions. And if he didn't get one right, I switched to a different question that I thought he could get right. And once we got something right, we built logically by moving on from that. And at the end of that series of questions, that student had changed. He clearly was not in fear anymore. In fact, I think it's safe to say that his demeanor in class, the look on his face, he felt validated. Like, oh, I can do this. Now, there are times in class where a student's really not with it. Maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe they bombed the quiz. Maybe they didn't take the quiz. Maybe they didn't prepare for class. And in some cases, I'll just simply move on to another student. If I think that we're about to have a meltdown that's going to be non-productive, I don't think it's helpful to follow up on that. But these are elements of teaching effectively in a classroom where you do a lot of questioning. And I have found that it's helpful to have students talk to each other about questions. I think this is something which is more common now than it used to be. I think they have a sense of need. And so giving them opportunities to talk to each other also helps build a sense of confidence when then they have to engage with me publicly.
Let's circle back around to who takes your course, because the majority of people in your course are not chemistry majors. They are not biochemistry and molecular biology majors. They are taking this course as part of a requirement within their major that this course may be foundational for additional chemistry courses, but they don't view themselves as chemists. So the engagement with students, you've alluded to, for instance, pharmacokinetics, which might be a good entry point for a biologist, for instance, who's taking this course as part of their biology major, which it is. So how do you make the questions compelling so that students are willing to do the work to delve deeply into the question and get an answer that will be satisfying to them and satisfying to a chemist?
That's not such an easy thing to do.
No.
I think a prerequisite in their thinking is they have to have a sense that they are making progress conceptually. I think this is foundational. Before you can do what you're referring to, you have to have everybody, as much as possible, on common ground in their thinking. If my explanations are terrible, that's gonna have negative consequences no matter what I do next. The teacher has to be able to break down complex ideas into understandable chunks and then connect them logically to put the big picture back together again. The teacher has to explain things clearly, make the course applicable to the student. I think that's what you're really asking about here is how do you make the course applicable to the student? And so when designing a course, you have to bear this in mind. You do have to consider what the students are majoring in. Now, I don't have, for example, nursing students in my general chemistry classes. There are separate courses that are somewhat like general chemistry that are designed for nurses. They're not on the same level as what I teach. They shouldn't be. That's also something that needs to be considered when you design a course. What level is this supposed to be on? How hard is this supposed to be? And regarding that, at the end of the day, in my general chemistry classes, at the end of the semester, the average student grade is usually a B-, which I think is pretty good for a college chemistry class. You might find some students to disagree with that, but that's my view on it. Let's talk briefly about the students that I do have. I do have students that are majoring in pre-med. Of course, you mentioned chemistry and biochemistry and molecular biology, but biology, cell biology, kinesiology, pre-med, pre-pharmacy, physics, pre-physical therapy, science education. I get all these people, and I have to bear in mind other courses that they're going to be taking. And I don't mean just other chemistry classes, although that's true. I know where they're going in their chemistry program, the chemistry part of their training. They're going to go from general chemistry to organic chemistry to biochemistry for many of them. But I also need to be aware of what other courses these students are taking. And I am pretty familiar with where they're going in their courses outside the chemistry department. I know a lot of what they're taking in biology. I know what's covered in those courses. And I know what kind of chemistry background they need to prepare them to succeed in those courses. I mean, if you're going to be studying how the human kidney works in a physiology and anatomy class, you've got to know some chemistry.
For sure.
If you're going to understand how diuretics work in a pharmacology class, you're going to need to understand some chemistry. You're going to need to understand some physiology and anatomy as well. And I have all these pieces in my brain. This is I think one of the blessings of the Lord having wired me to be interdisciplinary. I've had all these interests and I've taken a lot of courses and I understand a lot about some of these other subjects that allow me to put things together. And so that's a blessing. Let me start with a comment that one of my students made in an evaluation. The student said that he's a very knowledgeable teacher who clearly explains the content and shows that he wants to be involved with the students and make the course applicable to them. The course covers many different topics in chemistry and makes it all applicable. Okay, so it's pretty common for me during class to ask a question like the following. How many of you have heard of such and such a topic in another class? And then they'll raise their hands. And I'll ask, oh, so what class or classes did you discuss this in? Or reference this in? Oh, so it was in a general biology class. Was it in a lab? Oh, yes, it was in a lab. Well, what did you do in lab? And so I follow up with a discussion about how what we're talking about connects to another course they're either currently in or a course they've had. And in some cases, I point them forward to courses they will have. So, for example, it might go like, how many of you are going to be taking organic chemistry at some point in time? And the hands go up. Well, when you do, this matter of hybrid atomic orbitals is going to be really important in that class, la 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 la. So I'm looking for opportunities. I'm frequently looking for opportunities, and I reference things that they care about. And when I do that, it's possible for me to take the topic of discussion and turn it in such a way that they see a greater sense of relevance. A good example of this is when we're talking about molecular orbital theory, which, goodness, sounds boring to the average person.
Arcane. Even.
Yes. Why would you care about that? And it's an application of quantum mechanics. Why would you care about that? Why would you care about molecular orbital theory? Well, when we talk about one of the events in human vision, which I do use as an example, it involves photons interacting with a particular chemical in the retina. And that particular chemical causes a bond to break. The photon causes a particular bond in that chemical to break. That causes a geometric change in the structure of that particular substance in the human eye. And that is an initiating event in human vision. It causes a cascade effect because there has to be an interaction between the photon and the eye somehow on a mechanism level for us to be able to see things. And then we talk a little bit about the ramifications of how fast that process is. But it's in the context of molecular orbital theory. That connects pretty much to everybody in the class because everybody cares about sight.
We all are invested in keeping our sight.
We are.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we could go on, and I know Brian's been developing the course. It wasn't that it was developed in his early years and now, he hasn't touched it in decades. So this is an ongoing concern, and appreciate his desire for learners to be put in a frame of mind where they're both motivated and supported so that optimal learning can happen and regularly does happen in his classroom. Thanks for giving us some insight into your methods, Brian.
You're welcome, and thanks for having me with you today, Mike.
If you're interested in learning more about the work of the Summer Institute in Teaching Science, please go to my website, deepanddurable.com. That's deep, A-N-D, durable.com for more details. Deep and Durable Learning is supported by the Science and Engineering Endowment Fund. Please consider a monetary gift to the Science and Engineering Endowment Fund to allow us to continue to produce the resources that are most helpful to you. You can give through a link at deepanddurable.com.